Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. In his excellent 2015 biography of the Grateful Dead, So Many Roads, The Life and Times of the Grateful Dead, author and renowned music journalist David Brown makes a very salient point about the difference between a live performance on stage and music recorded in a studio. To liberally paraphrase him, what he says is this: a live show is like an engaging dialogue between two people who are excited by the interaction. A studio recording, on the other hand, is like a carefully crafted, well-organized, well-thought-out speech that you can take home with you and can be just as engaging. This brings us to the Grateful Dead themselves. They were the iconic American band that, for all intents and purposes, basically created the hippie jam band movement, scene, and culture that would bring us the Allman Brothers Band and Little Feat in the 1970s. In the 1990s, the Dead's legacy and model for a fanatical following going on tour with them would give birth to legendary jam band stalwarts Fish, the Dave Matthews Band, and Blues Traveler. And even to this day, neo jam bands like Garcia Peoples and indie rock darlings Vampire Weekend produce music that echoes the free-form inclusivity and adventurous spirit of Jerry Garcia and his band of hippie misfits. The Grateful Dead's career as a live band lasted almost exactly 30 years from the mid-1960s until Garcia's death in 1995. And the foundation of their reputation is the inspiring improvisational splendor of their marathon live shows. In fact, there are dozens of podcasts right now devoted to live Dead shows, such as The Enduring Power of Deadhead Culture. However, the Curmudgeon Rock Report is here to take a different tack. We want to take a retrospective look at perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the Grateful Dead's music: their visionary studio albums. No, they didn't display the sonic wizardry of the Beatles or Pink Floyd, nor did they ambitiously reframe the parameters of what constitutes rock, such as The Who or David Bowie. What the Dead did, though, is take all their diverse influences and effectively create a new kind of American music, and at times even a new kind of American mythology, that looked to the spacey cosmos just as much as it was grounded to the earth. They were known for their lengthy improvisational jams, but they also wrote short, concise songs of lyrical beauty, melodic wonder, and structural innovation that continue to inspire and influence younger generations of artists who like to delve into American roots music and infuse it with, shall we say, a little psychedelic sparkle and pixie dust. This is the first of 2 episodes examining the Grateful Dead studio output, with this first episode focusing on their early years and the 5-album run of classics they released on Warner Brothers from 1967 to 1970. What a long, strange trip it will be.
Now, Arturo, you and I could basically sit here and discuss which version of Tennessee Jed from the 1972 European tour that the Dead did is better.
Yeah.
But that is not our lane. We acknowledge, as you did at the top here, that there are many, many, many podcasts dedicated lovingly to the live work and live shows of the Dead. So we're not going to be in that lane. We are definitely much more comfortable with recorded music on this here podcast, aren't we?
Well, we can talk about live shows, but the Dead have like what? 5,673 of them. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do like
Yeah.
the six studio albums they did. Actually, the five studio albums they did between 1967 and 1970.
Yep, and again, so that's a more appropriate thing, and we'll keep it academic, and we'll go through all of those albums. Really looking forward to having this conversation with you because I know that you have more of a head start on deadology than I do, but I'd like to think I've caught up over the years. But no, this will be interesting to kind of compare notes with each
Yeah.
other. That said, any other new things in your world?
Yes, in my world, well, just to introduce a little bit of my world to everyone else's world, after this episode and the next episode, which will be part two of this Grateful Dead in the Studio, a Legacy. If you're interested, there is a wonderful book by the music journalist, and renowned critic David Brown. So Many Roads, The Life and Times of the Grateful Dead came out late 2015. It is pretty much the authoritative book on the history and biography of the band. If you're interested in that monolith of a book, go check it out.
For sure. With that said, we've been ruminating about the real universe, but now, hello, we're now in the parallel universe. The parallel universe is where the bad music is definitely still bad, but the great music is actually up there on a pedestal, and we get to talk about albums and artists that really should get their props over here, but over there are fabulous hits. And so this is a segment, again, the parallel universe, that Arturo and I, every episode, we each give a brief description of, and we engage in a discussion of an album by an artist we think is worthy of your respect. And also, to let you know, over here in the parallel universe, we also have what we call the parallel vault. So these may not be albums that came out 2 weeks ago,
Right.
but they are of recent vintage, as in of the last decade. And so both of us this week, this is kind of the damning of faint praise. 2022, I've started to call the year of the pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, we're not going to talk about pretty good. We're actually going to go back a few years and talk about great. And so, with that said, who you got, Arturo?
Well, and before I get into it, I just want to mention that this is the special suicide edition of the Parallel Vault and the Parallel Universe.
Yes, it is.
Both of these albums deal with songs about suicide, and one of them by someone who actually did commit suicide. So
Yeah. So yeah, this is the cheeriest one we've done in a while for sure.
anyway, the album I'm talking about, or I will talk about, is the Manchester, UK band Money, and their album from 2016, Suicide Songs. Now, Money released their first album, The Shadow of Heaven, in 2013 to positive critical reviews, but not much commercial success. And it's easy to see why. The band took their cues from the lush, piano ballad heavy pop rock of noughties bands such as Coldplay and Keane, and made their songs even longer, sappier, and more sentimental. Basically, dream pop for people who think the Cocteau Twins are too heavy. However, however, something must have happened to the band on the way to making their second album. My guess is that their musical tastes expanded and improved. Hey, sometimes young bands can get better. What resulted in their second album, a quantum leap from their first one, Suicide Songs, released in January 2016, was the sound of Coldplay taking a trip down to Jonestown, as in the swirling 1960s psychedelia of the Brian Jonestown massacre, and meeting Echo and the Bunnymen along the way. The influence of the latter band's classic 1984 album Ocean Rain looms large, as the songs on Suicide Songs have an epic grandeur about them, delivered with a forcefulness and a confidence that belies the mushy softness of their debut. You know you're in for something special when the guitar orchestra splendor of the opening track, I Am the Lord, unfolds like a circular flower on acid. Tabla inspired rhythms, violins, cellos, and multi tracked guitars, some of them tuned to sound like sitars, swirl together with a beauty that would have made Sgt. Pepper's era George Harrison blush with envy. The album pulls off the trick of having a uniform, cohesive sound throughout, yet not come across as same sounding and monotonous due to the variety of instrumental textures and sparkling melodies. Yet nothing prepares the listener for the jaw dropping centerpiece of the album, All My Life. The song is a tour de force of doomed love, hopelessness, and yearning set to a glorious power riff and a surging, swaying ballad of celestial power that makes lyrics such as "All my life I've been searching for something, so I and always ended up with nothing," makes words like those drive home with clear-headed profundity. Any list of best songs of the decade of the 2010s has to include this song on it. This album takes a strong influence from the entire album does, from the Brian Jonestown Massacre. But Anton Newcomb himself has never written a song this moving. And that's saying something, because I'm a huge Jonestown fan. Money have released literally nothing since this album came out. Quite a bit about this band is shrouded in mystery. And that's a hard thing to do in today's media saturated, social media obsessed era.
Sure is.
Rumors of inner band strife and turmoil have buzzed around, but they haven't officially broken up. The band's website is still up and active. Who knows? Maybe they committed suicide. I don't know. Then again, the mystery only enhances the beauty, power, and reputation of Suicide songs. As with Jeff Mangum and Neutral Milk Hotel, perhaps Jamie Lee and his bandmates realized that they'll never top their achievement on Suicide songs, so why bother? In any case, go check out Money's Suicide songs, one of the most breathtakingly beautiful, stirring, startling albums of the past 10 years.
And it's worth mentioning that the best and probably most reliable place to find this record is on YouTube in terms of quick access. It's not really readily available on the streaming services.
Right.
YouTube is where I accessed it to get ready for this episode. Yeah, good album. You pretty much said it right, that if you're going to make an album this relentlessly moody and stuck in, or basically made in the name of yearning, it's good to change up the instrumentation. And put strings here, horns over there, keys there. You mentioned some of the influences on that YouTube. Basically, somebody put the entire album up there. It's like a 46-minute record. Put the entire record up there, and somebody in the comments had a great comment. It's as if the Verve and the Antlers had a baby.
I agree with some of the Verve. I can see that, especially early Verve. I don't see the Antlers though. I don't hear that.
Yeah, little bit. I mean, in terms of the moodiness, in terms of some of the melodic touches. I also, generally speaking, I think any sort of modern experiments with reverb and kind of spooky sounding like you're singing from outer space probably tips a cap to My Morning Jacket. And, and in a way, maybe going back Galaxy 500 a little bit. But,
right.
Yeah. So I wish there had been. The tempos are kind of relentlessly mid-range, and there's a melancholy. There's nothing celebratory, and there's nothing truly crawling ballady here.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's varied enough, and some good lyrics. I mean, like I said, it's not bullshit lyrics. It's pretty much from a heartfelt place, and so that's what you want for sure.
Yeah, totally.
And so, speaking of which, I mean, this gives me a good segue. So, we've said, so this is an album called Suicide Songs. One of the songs on it is actually called Suicide Song, singular. And there's a lyric on that I really, really like, where it says, "I know some of us need to turn the light into dark. It's remarkable that some of us can't." which which is kind of I don't know, kind of a pessimistic way of looking at optimism.
Yeah.
Now you take that and you put that against a lyric from the album that I'll be covering, the brilliant Purple Mountains, with their self-titled titled album from 2019. Lyric from a song on that called "Nights That Won't Happen," that goes, "When the dying's finally done and the suffering subsides, all the suffering gets done by the ones we leave behind." And then in the chorus, it goes, "Nights that won't happen, time we won't spend with each other again," which, when you think about it, is kind of like a really twisted take on Imagine. Imagine if I wasn't here anymore.
Yeah.
And so I use that as a transition because Purple Mountains was the brainchild of David Berman. Some of you may know that name if you're of similar age and demographic of Arturo and I. Some of you might remember the name David Berman from the late 90s. He was the head of a band called Silver Jews, which for spells featured two of his college friends from the University of Virginia, Stephen Malkmus and Bob Nastanovich of Pavement. No, it was not a Pavement side project. This was a David Berman thing. And so here's a guy who's heavily influenced by alt country and by power pop, but was a poet before he was a musician. I've read some things. There was an oral history in the University of Virginia's student magazine right after Berman's death that said that he would write the lyrics first and then put music to them. So I say all of that because Berman had been dormant for a long time, and he finally reemerges on July 12th, 2019 with this album under the band name Purple Mountains and self-titled called Purple Mountains. Again, released on July 12th, 2019. Berman committed suicide on August 7th, 2019. Now, while it would pretty much be unfair and cruel to call the album a suicide note, it certainly was a window into the mind of Berman, who struggled for decades with depression, serious drug addiction, and then more depression. And after all, he did end the record with a jaunty, countrified pop ditty called "Maybe I'm the Only One for Me." And the album also features other songs titled "All My Happiness Is Gone" and "Darkness and Cold." But here's the thing. This is probably the most beautiful, most hopeful sounding record about living with chronic misery, stress, loneliness, and desperation I've ever heard in my life. There's also a wisdom here and at times a sweetness to the lyrics amid all of the heartache in Berman's life that I really find fascinating. This isn't a truly blatant exercise in bleakness. I mean, take this amusing couplet from the opening song, "That's the Way I Feel." It says, "When I try to drown my thoughts in gin, I find my worst ideas know how to swim," which is a pretty good deadpan, self-deprecating line. And so it's a really tight song cycle that kind of goes on like this. Very lovely melodies. Obvious inspiration comes from the alt country bands such as Wilco and the Jayhawks, and from Beck Hansen. Berman was one of these guys who was a great non-singer singer, in that he could capture melodies in a very kind of ick type of voice. Anyway, one other song to talk about a little bit before I kick it back over to you, Art. There's another song on here that strikes a little too much of a mental chord with me, and it's called "She's Making Friends, I'm Getting Stranger." Now, at the time of his death, Berman was in bad shape. His mom had just died, and he was deeply, deeply, deeply in debt. But also, he had gotten so depressed and had gotten so hard to live with that his wife, while she stayed his best friend, they were separated because evidently Berman, he just became a guy that she couldn't live with. And so this is kind of a lampoon on that, this idea of,
Right.
of here I am in this relationship. And so it's got this other line in. And again, this guy's an amazing lyricist. It's got a line in there that says, I see lots of normal men yearning to obtain her. I'm a loser. She's a gainer. That's one thing of which they're dang sure.
Hmm.
And so again, it's very deadpan. It's very self-deprecating, but very funny, but also very poignant. And so Berman just had a real gift as a lyricist and as a non-singer singer, and just really engaging. And so it's really a damn shame that he killed himself so close after this, because that's what it'll be remembered for, as opposed to, the raw honesty and the sort of the poetics of Misery. It won't stand as an artistic statement. It'll stand as a record that came out before its maker uh, hung himself. So
Right.
yeah, it's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, this is like you said, there's never been such happy, joyful music set to sadder, more depressing lyrics. You'd have to really go back to some of those long lost albums of the 1960s and 70s to find something of that ilk. I was never really a big fan of David Berman and his Silver Jew stuff. I respected him, but I never was really a fan. I found his voice a little too deadpan, and
Yeah,
his earlier lyrics to be a little too precious.
yeah,
This album is definitely a cut above musically and lyrically from anything that he's really, I think, done before. There's a part of me that would have said, well, the lyrics are a little too overwrought and a little too maudlin in its depression, but the guy died 1 month after this album was released, so I can't really say
yeah.
that.
Hey, at least he was being honest. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, the rock and roll podcast space is replete with shows dedicated to the majesty of the Grateful Dead, created with the kind of dedication and granularity that we only kinda sorta approach here. Kinda sorta, of course, is pretty generous, but work with us. It's pretty cool to dig around for what's out there to learn all about the amazing mythology and history of the band, and especially about the miles and miles and miles of live show tapes for old heads and newbies to explore alike. We just wanted to take a moment here to give a shout out to some of the best of these Grateful Dead oriented podcasts: The Dead Pod, Dead and Gone, Working Man's Pod, No Simple Road, Code Names, Dead Show of the Month, Help on the Way, and we certainly must not leave out the official Grateful Dead podcast, Good Old Grateful Dead Cast. It is an honor to be part of this wider rock and roll podcast community. Everyone in it teaches us just so much, and these podcasts that dissect and deify the Grateful Dead are among the best of the bunch. Check them out where you check out all of the other podcasts. Now, here is one thing about the Grateful Dead before we start talking about these first 5 records that they did and released between 1967 and 70. Like a lot of other famous rock bands that emerged in the early mid 60s, the Dead meaning, they had their origins in skiffle and as a skiffle band. Now, skiffle is a uniquely American art form. It's a smorgasbord of Americana. Take jazz and bluegrass and blues and Appalachia and do all of this, and then make a jamboree out of it with makeshift acoustic instruments, washboard, T-chest, bass, and just all kinds of other strange instrumentation. And it's just a exotic, fun, experimental concoction, and really a lot. And it lends itself to acoustic guitar type sounds. So the Dead started off as a skiffle band. The Beatles started off as a skiffle band, and several other well-known, The Animals being one of them. They started off as skiffle bands. But here's the thing: those other bands all eventually morphed into very orthodox boogie woogie rock and roll bands. The Dead, I would maintain, were the skiffleest of all of these skiffle band, skiffle origined famous rock bands. In the sense, I don't think they ever lost that spirit of joy and of weird and of twisting and bending and seeing what else we could we could add to the mix. And so, with that said, this is where we start to see them learn to capture that spirit and that mix and that brew here, starting from the beginning. With that said, Arturo, tell us a little bit about how the Dead became the Dead.
A very brief description, because this
Sure.
this is a novel in of itself. But anyway,
Yes.
the original core members of the Dead: Jerry Garcia guitar, Phil Lesh bass, Pigpen McKernan keyboards, Bill Kreutzmann drums, Bob Weir rhythm guitar. They all came together in Palo Alto, California, which, for those of you who don't know, it's near Stanford University, way up in Northern California. And specifically, it was the Palo Alto folk scene, the coffee house folk scene, where these guys all gathered. But here's the thing, and this is the really important aspect to realize. None of these guys, none of these five people had a rock and roll background. They all had backgrounds in different styles and genres of music. With Garcia, who hailed from San Francisco, his background was purely folk, country, and if blues, acoustic country blues. And of course, bluegrass. That was Garcia's background. Phil Lesh was a classically trained musician. He was also from the Northern California area. I believe he went to a high school that was that had a specialized music program that taught students how to read, write music, and how to compose. And Phil Lesh was part of that. Until he joined the members that would become the Grateful Dead, he was purely a classical music buff. Ron McKernan, Pigpen, known to all his friends back then, his background was strictly blues, and maybe R&B. Back then, it was rhythm and blues. His father actually was a pretty well-known R&B DJ back in the day. Bill Kreutzmann, the drummer, was a teenage jazz prodigy as a drummer. His background was jazz, and that's what he wanted to be. He wanted to be a jazz drummer. And then Bob Weir was basically he was adopted by a military family and was pretty much a spacey bohemian as a teen. He's kind of a spacey old man now, but he was a spacey teenager back then. And his musical background is whatever, man. And anyway, they got together in Palo Alto. And they all knew each other in the folk scene, as part of the folk scene, and they hung out there. The notion of rock and roll didn't really come to them, if they knew about it, I'm sure they all knew about it, but they weren't really into it until something happened in early 1964 when the Beatles exploded on television, later in movie theaters, on all over pop culture, all over the radio, and countless musicians who were playing different kinds of music said, shit, let's start a rock and roll band. And that's what happened with the members of the Dead. Now, I really went into their musical backgrounds, being disparate. Folk here, classical here, blues here, jazz there. All of that is really important to note, because the Grateful Dead, the members, the guys who became the Dead, came around to rock and roll really late in their lives. For some of them, it wasn't until the Beatles that they became interested in rock music. So unlike a lot of their peers of their generation, other 1960s white rock bands, most of them grew up as teenagers in the 1950s loving rock and roll. The Beatles, as you mentioned earlier, Chris, are one of them. A lot of the other Bay Area bands, they were all lovers of 1950s rock and roll, of Elvis and Chuck Berry and all that stuff. The members of the Dead were not like that. They were not into that first wave of rock and roll. They came into that much, 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 much later. And because of that, because of those different, unique musical backgrounds and separate musical backgrounds, because they came into rock and roll late, that is why the Dead took a very different approach to rock music from all the other bands in the Bay Area. It's what eventually gave them such a powerful, innovative, and original sound, because they came at rock and roll from a different angle. Sure. They weren't purists like Janis Joplin. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. just to offer a thought on that, I think that the thrill of the weird,
Yeah.
that's kind of where it comes from, because it's like, oh, well, that's different, or how can we combine these things and all that, because they have that sensibility, and they're just sort of they were sort of they were learners of music. They were sponges, and
Right.
so and like you get five sponges in the same room, that's a whole lot of absorption, and so I know that Lesh in some interviews, and even Bob Weir said that they kind of took pride in being weird and
Yeah.
taking those chances, and throwing curveballs for the sake of the beauty of the curveball. And
Right.
so,
Right.
that was a good way of setting that up.
Yeah.
So,
So anyway, the Dead. Well, the members of the Dead. Let's be a rock band. Well, late 1964, early 1965, that's what they did. They formed a ramshackle garage band called the Warlocks. And what separated the Warlocks from all of the other garage rock bands that were around at the time is that, like you said, Chris, they had that sense of adventurousness. And the Warlocks insisted on improvising songs in pizza parlors and in two-bit bars around town. That's how they really kind of cut their teeth. The pizza parlor is where they met Phil Lesh. Phil Lesh was like one of the last people to join the band. The original bass player, Garcia, thought wasn't good enough and couldn't hack it. Phil Lesh came in, who had never played bass guitar before, but he had that classical music background, so he was able to pick up the bass in due time. And anyway, that's when you get the Warlocks, and they were bumming around through 1965. Enter LSD.
yes,
They start taking that drug quite a bit. They changed their name to the Grateful Dead. And in late 65, all the way through 66, they start playing as the house band in Ken Kesey's acid test events. These are basically house parties where people will show up, trip off their balls and their asses on LSD, and there would be a multimedia show all around them. Lights, strobe lights, film projectors showing old films that Ken Kesey's group themselves filmed on a road trip back in 1963. And the Grateful Dead, of course, they themselves, high off their asses, would be improvising music to these film projections, and these strobe lights and these colored lights. Very much at the exact same time, the Velvet Underground and the Andy Warhol scene were doing a very similar thing in New York in 1966. And
sure.
these two bands never crossed paths. So that's interesting how things happen to two opposite coasts of the country, two bands, two artists doing very similar things, just then, and they don't know about it. They don't know of each other at all. But
Yeah,
anyway,
it is fascinating.
the Grateful Dead got their notoriety, and I probably stressed the word notoriety from these acid test shows, and eventually they started playing around town, and eventually they moved to San Francisco later in '66. And they became part of the burgeoning San Francisco music scene that also included Quicksilver Messenger Service, Big Brother and the Holding Company, which will eventually include Janis Joplin, and Moby Grape. So a lot of those artists and bands started getting signed because the buzz around the Bay Area was really becoming a serious thing. So hoping to tap into the San Francisco scene's burgeoning buzz and to beef up their rock band roster, A&R decided to sign the Grateful Dead, and this decision came by the legendary A&R sorry, not A&R, Warner Brothers. My mistake. Warner Brothers signed the Dead. Joe Smith was the legendary A&R manager working for Warner Brothers at the time, who signed the Dead directly to Warner Brothers. And boy, did he not know what he was getting into.
No, he did not. And for anybody out there who wants, if you want to dedicate 4 hours of your time, we strongly recommend. It was I think Amazon produced it, but it was a 4 hour documentary called A Long Strange Trip uh, on the Dead that came out, what, about 10 years ago now at this point?
No, 10, like more like 6.
Okay.
Co-produced by Martin Scorsese, who,
Oh,
by the way, is in the middle of directing, if he hasn't finished already, a biopic about the life of Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, starring what's his face there, Jonah Hill of
Yes.
all people is Jerry Garcia. So
Yeah.
that ought to
Yeah.
be interesting. So so that really kind of sets us up. They get signed by Warner Brothers, and so now they've got backing. There's a little bit of buzz because of their status as the house band for Ken Kesey, and so yeah, I guess we need to make a record.
And they did. And the Grateful Dead's first album is just self-titled, The Grateful Dead. Came out 1967. The Dead's debut album from the year of the Summer of Love, which we all know is 1967, is quite possibly the most undead-like album in their entire discography.
Easily.
There are a couple of reasons for that. First, it's their most raw, garage rocky, straightforward album. When they went into the studio in January and cranked it out in just 1 month, everything, basic tracks, overdubbing, mixing, 1 month, they were fewer than 2 years removed from their origins as the Warlocks. So the album has this kinetic, speedy, live band in the studio energy. And it makes sense. They had never entered a studio before. So trying to replicate their live show at the time was an understandably default attitude. Second reason why it was so different from all the other Dead albums, because it was their first time in the studio and they were on a tight budget being a new band, they didn't have time to mess around with experimentation or indulgence. Yes, Jerry Garcia's guitar, man, he plays solos all over this record, especially on the epic raver of Voila Lee Blues, but they're controlled, almost practiced solos. This is all anathema to what the Dead eventually stood to represent. But all of this actually enhances the debut album. Aside from the garage rock energy, there's a sparkling, pristine, clear, straight to the gut sound captured on this record that the band rarely returned to in ensuing years. I mentioned how the band members' disparate musical backgrounds led to them having the most unique and innovative sound of the San Francisco bands. On this record, it's that sound, but sped up within a very endearing restlessness bordering on aggression. I think this is a really, really underrated album in their discography.
Yeah, I think it's good. I've never been. I'm not. I won't. I'm not a huge fan of the record, but I will say it's good. It's really kind of a fascinating listen in the sense of when you listen to side one. Yes, it's very garagey and it's very bluesy. And Pigpen is Ron McKernan is really the star of this record. I mean, the organ pretty much is a dominant feature of a lot of these songs. I mean, I always love Cold Rain and Snow, which sounds like it comes out of a late 50s sock hop.
Yeah.
Which is just the very sort of bouncy type of song. And so you're like, wait a second, this is the Dead. It's got this sort of, echoey sheen to it. It's like you said, you've got, sort of bluesy and poppy and garagey and all of this kind of stuff. It's like, where's this coming from? And then you get the side two, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden, it's like the Dead is becoming the Dead in real time. And you get the side two, and then you've got a streak there, which is Morning Dew, New Morningwood Blues, and Viola Lee Blues, and
Voila Lee.
Voila Lee Blues.
Yeah, as in the French, voila.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, now they're they're actually the Dead with these sort of real pathos, and Garcia starts to flex his guitar muscles, both as a creator of clean, lovely lead lines in ballads, and also as obviously a kick-ass soloist who took his bluegrass and sort of country and folk training and translating it to chugging electric guitar. Morning Dew is an interesting case because that is a cover of a 1962 folk song by a lady named Bonnie Dobson.
Yep.
And it's a narrative that describes a couple having a dialogue after they've just survived a nuclear holocaust.
Yeah.
And so in Bonnie Dobson's hands, there's a 1969 recording of it by Dobson, and you can find it out there on the streaming services. Really schmaltzy. It,
Right.
I mean, it sounds like it could be from a party scene in Midnight Cowboy, or it could
Yeah.
be from, like I don't know, some of the more melodramatic stuff that was coming out in the late 60s.
Yeah.
Uh, and so in her hands, I guess in some ways it's more sly in the sense that it's not quite as obvious that it's this, post-Holocaust drama.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Garcia gets it and he Americanizes it up and really plays up the drama. And it's just got this lovely sparseness to it.
Yeah, I mean, like all great covers, Garcia and the Dead really make this song their own,
Sure.
and they do it because Garcia, in particular, sings the song with a pained conviction and sympathy that kind of belies his reputation as an average singer. On
Mhm.
this song, his voice is sonorous, it's deep, it's powerful, and of course, there's that heavenly guitar that glides throughout the song,
Oh, yeah.
through and around Bill Kreutzmann's Marshall drum beat.
Oh, yeah.
Garcia's voice and guitar always were featured parts of the Dead's patented sound. But at this early stage in the band's career, Garcia really carried and pushed things forward. And this song, in particular, of all the songs of the debut album, it's this song that became a staple of their live repertoire for many years afterward.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Worth mentioning, by the way, one of the reasons that I'm not a huge fan of this record, it's a 9-song album, 7 covers. Uh, so,
Yeah,
so there's
yeah,
one song, the album opener, that was written. It has like a collective band writing credit, and then there's another one song written by Garcia. They're the 2 worst songs on the record. Uh, and so, but it also showed, and so that maybe I'm lamenting that they hadn't figured out how to really write songs at that point. But at the same time, in concert, they are one of the greatest coverers and
mm,
interpreters of other people's music of all time. I mean, just
right,
like the version of "Good Lovin'" that predominated
yeah,
their sets through the '70s
sure,
is an example. So
yeah. I mentioned you mentioned Voila Lee Blues. To me, that's one of the other standouts at this
yeah,
in this record.
I
At the
agree.
10-minute mark, it's by far the longest track on the album and arguably its centerpiece. It was definitely one of the highlights of the band's live act at the time, and you can hear why. Starting as a tight as fuck mid-tempo blues rock jugler, very simple, kind of like a proto CCR kind of track.
Yeah,
It picks up speed and transforms into like this hyper speed freak out. And Garcia's stinging, needly guitar lines lead the way as the song crashes back into its motif, riff, and tempo. Another thing about this track, they performed at the Monterey Pop Festival in summer of 1967, and they were filmed, but the band did not want to be included in the film.
right.
They were filmed for the film, but they did not want to be included in the movie. They adamantly refused to be so. And the track that the director, I think that was the D.A. Pennybaker, I think,
Yes.
wanted to put in it was their performance of Voila Lee Blues,
Yeah.
and that was what the Dead said. Nope. Yeah, the best song on our debut album played for 15 minutes in an awesome jam. No, we don't want it we don't want it in the movie that's going to define flower power forever. No.
Well, yeah, but maybe it was reverence because the guy they were covering there was an old jug band bluesman from the early 20th century. I think he's from Louisiana, named Noah Lewis,
Yeah.
and so maybe it was reverence for sort of the origins of that. But also, it kind of speaks to that the Dead were not pretentious by any stretch, but they were very guarded about how their music and basically in terms of how they even though they loved the kind of the weird independent spirit, nobody was in control of the Dead's destiny,
Yeah.
other than the Dead, and
Right.
so it kind of speaks to that ethos.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, well, Chris, you are so on the self-titled debut. I think it is a shining, beautiful, underrated nugget in their discography, partially because they've never done anything like it ever since.
Right.
However, their next album, oh boy, now, now, now we go into something different here. While the self-titled debut album was recorded as quickly as possible, with as few hassles as possible, the making of Anthem of the Sun, their second album from 1968, was the 180-degree opposite. The previous album took 1 month to take, whereas this album took 6 months, utilizing 4 different studios. Drug use was rampant throughout the sessions for the album, weed, acid, and nitrous oxide being the featured items on the menu. And it seemed as if the band were really trying to capture the psychedelic experience on record. And that they did, and then some. Listening to Anthem of the Sun for the first time is a jarring, dizzying, disorienting experience. Studio recordings and recordings of their live shows are combined, weaving in and out, often within the same song. But after repeated listens, the album actually emerges as the most rewarding acquired taste record in the Dead's discography. Mickey Hart had joined the band at this point as their second drummer, and the combination of him and Bill Kreutzmann not only added power and muscle to their sound, but also a subtle world music inspired touch that acted as a counterpoint to Kreutzmann's jazzy style. At this point, the band was improving by leaps and bounds as a live band. In fact, this was the period when they were establishing the densely layered improvisational sound they became legendary for. And it was especially evident with Phil Lesh's thick, loud, limber, snaky bass lines that acted more like a lead guitar than a bass. Their conventional songwriting skills were still evolving, more on that with their next album. But this is the studio album, or quasi studio album, that best represents the Grateful Dead's thundering, epic live sound at the time. Many albums of this period have been claimed to be psychedelic classics, but Anthem of the Sun is a rarity even among that crowd. It's an album conceived by musicians on drugs, recorded while they were on drugs, that still manages to reveal layers of beauty and sonic innovation with each listen.
Yeah, I with you on that. Yeah, this record, you can't really look at an album like this as like a traditional album. It's not about the songs, and it's more about a mood. It's you can look at it as psychedelic rock as an academic exploration, and I've made this, and I talked about this record way back when in the early days of this podcast. I talked a little bit about it on our one of our vaults segments. This album is you can compare it to a shattered stained glass window,
Yeah.
and the pieces are a hell of a lot more interesting than the whole pile of like glass. It's like it just when you look at it. So you have this shard here and this shard there. Uh, I don't know if anything on this really counts as a song.
Hmm.
I think the closest thing to it is Nuke Potato Caboose with
Yeah.
Phil Lesh, and I say that because at least the long solo jam follows from Lesh's pretty melodic structure.
Yeah.
It's not kind of a random segue there. But and so to me, there's you can take there's the double drum transition on album opener. That's it for the other one, which is essentially, like you said, how Mickey Hart introduces himself to the mix. There's the kazoos of Alligator, which is about the most skiffle touch that you'll find in a on a Dead record. And then then like you said, they go in and out of studio and the live stuff. The end of the record is extraordinary. The last track, which is just basically like a big old jam and spliced together. I don't even think it's one jam called "Caution: Do Not Stop on Tracks."
Yeah.
Uh, that gets fascinating because it just turns into this blanket of noise feedback art. So it's pretty neat. Alligator, I've always been a fan of. There's a couple of things about that one. Uh, One, it's the first time that Robert Hunter, who we'll talk a lot about in subsequent albums throughout this series of looking at these albums. Robert Hunter makes his first appearance, co-writing the lyrics of Alligator with Pigpen, and that song really kind of evokes Lewis Carroll and some of the stuff that author Shel Silverstein was doing at the time. Silverstein's most famous in rock and roll, anyway, for writing the lyrics to a boy named Sue by Johnny Cash. And
Right.
so, yeah, like you said, it's a great capturing of the spirit of the times, of the just sort of the druggy, let's take a trip into the deepest recesses of our minds to see what slop we can dig up.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's and it's you're talking about the making of this record harkens back to the documentary. There's a wonderful sequence in that where they're talking to Joe Smith, the A&R man, about how much of a headache that was, because I guess at one point Bob Weir tells this story. Weir was, he was like tripping balls, like, extra strength, and he wanted to push for them to have a mobile recording unit to go out to the beach so that they could record the colors of the wind, or the sing.
What it was, I would record the sound of the air.
There we go. It was the sound of the air, and this is kind of wild thing. And Joe Smith is like, "What? Well, please save me from this bullshit." It's just, poor guy.
Yeah. However, for all our younger fans out there who really do not want to sit through an entire sitting of Anthem of the Sun, we'll recommend some choice tracks, quote unquote songs, that you can probably find on Spotify. I recommend That's It for the Other One,
Yes.
which was a staple of Dead shows for years after Anthem of the Sun came out. And it marks the beginning of one of the greatest facets and aspects of the band's music, prog rock Dead, a multi-section suite of tracks that goes through a number of time signature changes, melodic shifts, and multiple guitar passages. Again, prog rock Dead. And of course, Chris, you mentioned Alligator, which is a bluesy shuffle and a platform for keyboardist Ron Pigpen McKernan to showcase his soulful blues man voice, but ends up being dominated by the drumming duel between Kreutzmann and Hart, and, of course, Garcia's blistering guitar solo.
Yeah, unbelievable soloing on that. The thing about That's It for the Other One, I think that's an important one to mention, because that's the first time we get what I'll call the patented Grateful Dead groove.
Yeah.
There is a distinct groove where there's kind of this kind of breezy, gentle sway of a groove that Garcia manages to. He fills in the spaces with his lead work, and and it's a nice sort of sonic pastiche.
Yeah.
And it's a patented groove that they would come to over and over and over and over again over the course of the next 20 years.
Right. Absolutely. And the next album, after the excesses and the indulgence, but the odd brilliance of Anthem of the Sun, comes the album where I think the Dead really had their turning point.
Yes.
And that is Aoxomoxoa from 1969, spelled Aoxomoxoa, for those if you want to know. In 1968, the Dead and their whole operation moved from San Francisco and into the rural surroundings of nearby Marin County. Different members moved into ranches, and the bucolic scenery immediately made an impact on the band's sound. Aoxomoxoa marked a transition from the full-blown acid rock of Anthem of the Sun to a slightly psychedelia-inflected brand of rock, encapsulating jazz, country, and folk music. People like to point to the following Working Man's Dead album as the band's movement to roots music, but it really started with Aoxomoxoa. Like the previous album, Aoxomoxoa took 6 months to make, but this time drug use and dysfunctional behavior were not the reasons. They had done recordings using the studio's usual 8-track recorder, but in early 1969, the studio brought in a brand new 16-track machine. The band decided to ditch their old recordings and start from scratch while getting accustomed to the new 16-track recorder. Of course, this didn't do anything to alleviate tensions with Warner Brothers, as the process put them further into debt with the record company.
Yeah.
The total cost ended up being $180,000, which doesn't sound bad until you consider that after adjusting for 2022 rates, that amounts to about $1,300,000.
Yep.
Yes, Joe Smith was pissed off.
Yep.
Yet, as far as long term artistic success and posterity go, the money was more than worth it. Aoxo Maxoa is another near masterpiece from a band that was artistically and creatively firing on all cylinders. More specifically, the album marks the true beginning of the Robert Hunter, Jerry Garcia songwriting partnership. This whole album, every single song is Hunter Garcia, as opposed to just a little bit of Hunter on the previous album. And that partnership, Hunter's lyrics, Garcia's music, would creatively define the band from here on out. Hunter was a folk musician pal of Garcia's from back in the Palo Alto coffee shop days. They became reacquainted in '68, and Hunter immediately started penning lyrics to Garcia's increasingly sophisticated music. Hunter's lyrics were imaginative and evocative, creating a psychedelicized parallel universe version of the American Wild West, where gamblers, outlaws, and all kinds of colorful characters go through their own existential crises. Considering the move the move rootsy or the rootsy moves and the Americana textures in their music, the Hunter collaboration was apt. Aoxo Moxoa perfectly captures a moment in time when the Grateful Dead had their feet on solid, earthy ground while keeping their eyes to the cosmos.
Yeah, this album is very, very, very strong. Now, I can just imagine. It's kind of amazing when you think about it that that debut record was out only 2 years
Yeah.
before this. Now you look at the Grateful Dead. You know, I said that first record. It's a good record, but it's a garagey type record that was not anything that was extraordinarily distinct from any of the other bands in that San Francisco scene. Basically,
Yeah.
2 years later, they have gone like into the cosmos like 1,000 times, more sophisticated. So I can just imagine, even if I had caught on to the Dead and like, yeah, okay, the Dead, they're Ken Casey's house band, they do all this crazy shit. And then you first hear Saint Stephen, which starts that record.
Right.
And that must have been like, whoa, at the time. And so I guess this is a record you mentioned. This is their first real dabbling into Americana, which is extraordinary to me because it plays like a psychedelic magic carpet ride
Yeah.
back into old timey days rather than into any Technicolor utopian future that you would
Right.
kind of associate. The acid kicks you to unknown regions. No,
Well, wait, it goes back to the ragtimey the old days and infuses the past with psychedelia.
yeah, exactly. Like even like some of the like doing that rag obviously is the most
Yeah.
glaring example of that. And then Dupree's Diamond Blues, which is just basically a very very sort of early century sort of countryish folk. This sort of the Ballad of Dupree, basically.
Yeah.
And it has that, and then you get other flavors on that. I mean, I love Cosmic Charlie.
Yeah.
Which just has this like wonderful. Again, it's kind of like that. It's got that Dead sway in it, but it's a more layered and textured version of it.
Yeah. Right.
Few other things that. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I want to other track recommendations for all you younger Spotify lovers out there. The weird, shifty rhythms and jazzy flourishes of the timeless classic that you mentioned, Chris, Saint Stephen, signal the increasing complexity of the Dead's music while remaining listenable, accessible, and downright catchy. One of the other enduring masterpiece tracks on this album, and there are many, you mentioned a few of them already. Another one is China Cat Sunflower, with its endearing earworm guitar riff. Few Grateful Dead tracks endured throughout the decades like this one, always a highlight of any of their live shows.
Yeah, which is a weird thing because if you look at, if you spend the time looking at their sets during their heyday, uh, China Cat Sunflower is like the only one of these songs that endured as far as as
Saint Stephen did a bit. Saint Stephen.
yeah, Saint Stephen was in and out, but China Cat Sunflower is the one that never dropped off or
Yeah.
never became obscure. And so a couple of this probably has my favorite Robert Hunter lyric on it from Saint Stephen. Can you answer? Yes, I can. But what would be the answer to the answer man? That's very hippy dippy psychology or philosophy right there. And then the only complaint I have about this, and maybe it's because I've never listened to this album fucked up on weed or psychedelics. What in the world is with What's Become of the Baby?
Yeah, that's the one track. That's the one track even Deadheads don't like.
Yeah, that just gets grating. And for folks that haven't heard this record, now we strongly recommend that you do hear this record. We'll be assembling a Spotify playlist that'll essentially just have all 5 of these records in the same playlist, and you can listen to them, in track order. This is 8 minutes of, I guess you could call it a spoken word poem. It's written by Hunter and recited by Garcia, but recited by Garcia, and I'm assuming because it was a 16-track recording, like all 16 tracks. Where he sounds like he's kind of singing this up to the heavens from another dimension, and it's like the worst kind of science fiction-y kind of shit imaginable. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. Yeah. And the lyrics are not even all that profound. And so that is the one misstep on an otherwise amazing record.
Yes, it is their true, in my opinion, it's their first masterpiece record. People check out the individual tracks on Spotify if you want, but check out the album Aoxomoxoa. But then came the true masterpiece streak. And we're going to start this off with Working Man's Dead from 1970. It's been said that the Grateful Dead's desire to make simpler American roots music was the impetus behind their on-record transition as the new decade started. The truth was the reason was practical and financial as well. After spending a fortune on both Anthem of the Sun and Aoxomoxoa and seeing only modest record sales in return, the band, encouraged by their new road manager, Sam Cutler, saw the need to be more fiscally responsible and make records as cheaply as possible. Therefore, back to the bare-knuckle approach of their first album. Now, other reasons existed for the expedited recording. Early in 1970, the band was busted for marijuana and LSD possession at a hotel in New Orleans, putting the band's future in doubt. The charges were eventually dropped when the band's lawyer made a, shall we say, healthy donation to the district attorney's election campaign. but at the time, it was a dark cloud over the band. An even darker cloud emerged when the band's manager at the time, Lenny Hart, drummer Mickey Hart's father, had embezzled thousands of dollars of the band's money and eventually fled with even more of their money. Conversely enough, it was perhaps all this negativity that led to the tender, almost defiantly light roots music-based mood of Working Man's Dead. As I mentioned earlier, the Dead were already trending toward blues, country, folk territory with Aoxomoxoa, but they went full bore with this one. What's striking about the album is simply the high quality and sophistication of the songcraft as the Garcia-Hunter collaboration reaches its peak. Songcraft had never been something associated with the Grateful Dead. After Working Man's Dead, it would be just as important to the band's legacy as their epic live shows. Many of the songs had already been road tested, shall we say, for almost a year before they went into the studio. But they took even more time to rehearse the material before entering the studio, primarily to perfect their vocal harmonies. For songs as delicate and precise as these, they require almost pitch-perfect vocal performances And the Dead brought their A game in regards to the vocal department. The Garcia Lesh Weir trio of voices never sounded better and more seamless than they did on this album. And for what it's worth, recorded in just 1 month in February 1970 and chock full of accessible and catchy songs for the radio, guess what? It was the first Grateful Dead album that gave the honchos at Warner Brothers something to be happy about. Why? It went as high as number 27 on the Billboard album chart. That's big for the Dead back
Yep.
then, and for a lot of these bands of that ilk.
Yeah, that's when they started to make some of that today's $1,000,000 back.
Yeah.
At that point, yeah, this is a really kind of amazing. As these albums go, you see the sophistication going, but then you see these. They kind of they're almost like we're the ultimate suspense band from album to album. It's like, oh, what are they going to
Yeah.
do next? And
Yeah.
so now you go from this sort of old timey psychedelia and kind of wackiness of Aoxomoxoa to now this very earthy, very organic, acoustic album that is definitely very steeped in country music, in folk music. Garcia had discovered the wonders and beauty of the steel guitar and
Right.
employs that quite a bit on this record, especially and most notably on the song Dire Wolf.
Yeah.
Where it stands out. And it's kind of amazing what can happen when these guys get away from the hazy parties of the city and head out there into the quieter, more focused country. You know what I mean?
Right.
And going out to the country.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's a quote from Jerry Garcia that I pulled off the net that I think is pretty telling and kind of sets up this segue into Working Man's Dead. Quote, "You have to be ready, and you also have to discard notions that are fondly held by a lot of musicians about sequences and notes and about scales and musical systems as a whole. If you think of music as a language, the space part is where you throw out all the syntax." Yeah.
Interesting.
Which is, that's yeah, pretty funky. And so the idea is don't be afraid to tear it all down and build it back up.
Right. And they definitely do that on this album, which is just simply one of the greatest records ever made. Choice tracks for all you Spotify youngsters out there. Has there ever been a more perfect campfire sing-along song than Uncle John's Band? One of the single greatest songs in the band's entire catalog. It's just an acoustic campfire song, folk beauty. You have Robert Hunter's collection of Wild West weirdo characters bring memorable charm to the jaunty country shuffle of the song you mentioned, Chris, Dire Wolf. One of Bob Dylan's favorite Dead songs, by the way, supposedly. And Dire Wolf, whose jaunty country shuffle belies a sense of fear and dread, where the narrator pleads in the chorus, "I beg you, if you don't murder me, please don't murder me." And of course, the album is one of the most anthemic songs in the Dead's entire discography. The rambling, ramshackle Casey Jones.
Riding that train,
Yeah.
high on cocaine.
Yeah, where cocaine use is explicitly mentioned in the chorus. Hey-oh!
Yeah, exactly. So we know what kind of trip they were on. Worth mentioning, as you said, calling it one of the greatest albums of all time. In the latest version of the Rolling Stones 500 greatest albums of all time poll / chart from again 2020, this one came in at number 409. In earlier editions, by the way, Anthem of the Dead was in that 500. That has since fallen out.
Yeah.
And can we just pause here for a second, by the way? Not really a segue. Everybody likes to talk about, just sort of mainstream rock press likes to talk about how 1971 was so great.
Yeah.
1970.
Yeah, I think that was even better.
That was an extraordinary year when you think about the stuff Neil Young was doing, Simon and Garfunkel, the original slate of Beatles solo records that came out of the gate.
First two Black Sabbath albums.
Yeah, Paranoid, Deep Purple and rock, Funkadelic, and just and so on and so on and so on. It is just a truly great year for rock and roll. and just a lot of bands at the height of their powers, including the Dead.
And you mentioned that in the last Rolling Stone 500 greatest albums list, Working Man's Dead slipped down to 400 something. However, the next album went up to
Yeah,
like the high 200s in the
yeah,
last list. So I guess this next album, my personal favorite of all the Grateful Dead albums, is the one that I guess younger journalists and musicians really turn to. And I'm glad to hear of it. That is American Beauty from 1970, their final album on Warner Brothers, and their final album of this streak of brilliant records that we're talking about. So soon after Working Man's Dead was released, the band went right back into the studio to record American Beauty. While mining the same American roots music of blues, country, and folk, this album is way more than just Working Man's Dead Part 2. If anything, it's a sonic expansion of the palette introduced on that previous album. This expansion is most evident in two areas. The first of which is a preponderance of major key folk melodies. The triad that opens the album, Box of Rain, Friend of the Devil, and Sugar Magnolia, is awash in bracing, hummable melodies and sunshine bright production and clarity that must have been startling for fans accustomed to the soupy murk of Anthem for the Sun. It's as if they were consciously trying to give Simon and Garfunkel a run for their money. The other major difference from the previous album is how the band ratcheted up their vocal harmonizing to another level. Nearly every track on this album features the three singing members of the Dead, Garcia, Weir, Lesh, in perfect vocal form, with their voices always high in the mix. You can tell the influence of Crosby, Stills, and Nash had seeped in at this point.
hmm
In fact, David Crosby himself eventually used several members of the Dead for the recording of his own solo album later in the year. Overall, though, American Beauty proved to be the purest example of the full flowering of the Grateful Dead's artistry, as the Garcia Hunter songwriting team continued to deliver not only some of the greatest songs in the band's discography, but some of the best songs in the entire canon of the rock genre. And it wasn't just Garcia Hunter. Robert Hunter wrote the lyrics to Phil Lesh's elegiac album opener, Box of Rain, which was inspired by the recent passing of Lesh's father. Hunter also provided the words to Bob Weir's Sugar Magnolia, an acid dried beauty of lush, hippie love sentiment that can even put the most stone hearted curmudgeon in a hippie dance reverie. Combined with Working Man's Dead, American Beauty was everywhere on FM rock radio in the summer and fall of 1970. And this duo of masterpieces set the stage not only for the Dead's incessant, endless touring during the next 3 years, but also opened the floodgates for the phenomenon known as Deadhead culture
yes.
fandom that would make the band one of the most enduringly popular American bands of the next 20 plus years.
Yeah, so you hit on a few of the points that I was going to bring up. One in particular, the fact that on that Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Albums of All Time poll in 2020, this album went up to number 215. One of the few white guy records of its era
Yeah.
that has kind of stood up and moved up as the demographic of the voters, the voting block has gotten younger and more diverse. However,
Yeah.
American Beauty is still moving up in its reverence among these younger generations. If this is not my favorite Dead record, we'll talk about that on that one in particular on part 2. However, I don't think that you can make much of an argument that this isn't their best. This is their best record. And I think just objectively, beautiful record, really varied. The playing all around is brilliant. The arrangements are there. The singing, especially, I said, the singing. They definitely were inspired by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And so there's two things that make me love this record. I am a huge fan of Addicts of My Life, which
Mm.
is the penultimate song on the record. This is one of Garcia and Hunter's true masterpieces, with this lyric about finding love within the haze of dreams. Just this
Mm.
really gentle, gorgeous guitar playing from Garcia, those harmonies, this kind of stretch, slow, almost not even elegiac, but it's almost like a hippie gospel tune.
Yeah.
Has that kind of vibe to it. Phil Lesh's bass playing, incredibly underrated bass player. Probably because, as you said, he was not, he only picked up bass to join the band. Basically, they said, "Hey, you want
Yeah.
to be in our band? Okay, learn bass." Okay, and so he doesn't play a bass like a bassist. I mean, there's no pocket with Phil Lesh. It's an expressive art instrument of its own. And so, if you listen to it, really subtle and just beautiful work that lifts that song up. And then also, I think this is the one record where you can say that when you think about the Dead, you think about the music, you think about Garcia's guitar playing, you think about some of the innovation, you think of some of the stylistic shifts. Yeah, Robert Hunter is there, but he's not necessarily primary. He is here.
Yeah.
This is his lyrics on this album are incredible, from the poignancy of Box of Rain to the rollicking fun of Truckin'. I mean, Truckin'. Yeah, this is not just the album that has Truckin' on it, but
Yeah.
it does have Truckin' on it. The
Yeah.
lyric.
Yeah. Trucking by, for all you younger listeners, was the biggest radio hit off this record. It's a rumbling blues rock monster that became one of the band's best and most reliable platforms for improvisational jamming in their live shows.
Oh yeah, and it's one of the great. There's a long and illustrious history in rock and roll of the travelogue song.
Yeah.
We're stuck on the road, and either we're having fun or we're not. I mean, think of like Grand Funk Railroads. We're an American band. That's one of the fun ones. Turn the page, Bob Seger.
Yeah.
But this one is just really just kind of, it's fun, but it also has its kind of, it has its barbs. The thing about Sweet Jane living on a diet of reds, vitamin C, and cocaine.
Yeah.
I mean, it always makes me crack up. I also love the description of New York being the city that's got its ways and means. And
Yeah.
you and I, having lived there for a long time,
Yeah.
it certainly did have its ways and means. So we haven't talked much about Hunter, and I think at the end of this episode, this is a good segue into it, because I think Hunter's stuff, I think, got stranger and more literate as it went along. Hunter's background is this: he grew up in the Bay. Him and Garcia were buddies. They met each other. Evidently, Garcia was dating a girl that had dumped Hunter, and so
Hmm.
they didn't necessarily see eye to eye at first, but they ended up being in a band together for a little bit. Uh, Hunter, he has the distinction of, really interesting tidbit here. In 1962, Stanford University, as funded through the great graces and generosity of the Central Intelligence Agency, agreed to sponsor trials and experiments with LSD, which the CIA was exploring as a possible mind control drug that they could weaponize. And so Hunter, who I believe was attending Stanford briefly, was able to participate in these experiments. And needless to say, maybe that's one of these things that helped shape the future and the color of the Dead. Here's a great quote from the obituary for Hunter. Hunter died in 2019. So in the New York Times obituary, they quote a guy who had written a book about these CIA experiments, Stephen Kisner. And so Kisner's quoted as saying, he, Hunter, was given LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline. Uh, and then it says, afterward, he wrote an ecstatic 6-page account of his experiences. Sit back, picture yourself swooping up a shell of purple with foam crests of crystal drops, soft nigh. They fall unto the sea of morning creep very softly mist.
Sounds like Grateful Dead lyrics.
Yeah, absolutely. And then continuing on, quote, years later, added Mr. Kinzer, a former correspondent for the New York Times, he recognized the irony of the CIA project, which was aimed at finding a mind control drug. The United States government was the United States government was responsible for creating the acid test and the Grateful Dead, and thereby the whole psychedelic counterculture. And
God bless America.
Yeah, absolutely. So Uncle Sam, it's given us many fine products of the military-industrial complex, one of which may actually be the Grateful Dead. I said, but Hunter he's just a very literate guy. He's fun and he's funny, but he can be really profound, as in some of the songs that we've mentioned here. Ripple was a great song from this. He told Rolling Stone at one point that his favorite lyric on any of his Dead songs was from Ripple. Let it be known there is a fountain that was not made by the hands of men. Which Ripple's a great song. I mean, that's just sort of great use of mandolin on there. But anyway, this is Hunter's finest moments, and where he proved that he wasn't just Garcia's lyricist and wasn't just the guy that put the words to the music. He actually was a full-fledged, very important member, really, of this band.
Sure. Yeah, totally. I mean, Robert Hunter was pretty much there all throughout, even toward the very end of the band, always in the background, always there, giving words mostly to Garcia, but to other members of the band. But it all really started in this era of the Grateful Dead, which brings us, Chris, to the very end of this first part of our special episodes, The Grateful Dead in the Studio, A Legacy. Our next episode will be part 2, in which basically we will explore the Grateful Dead's studio output of the 1970s, starting with their first album on their own Grateful Dead Records label. They had their own independent label back in the 70s. This is before the whole punk rock, indie rock thing started. The Dead had their own label, and that album came out in 1973. And we're going to go from there onward up until 1980 and the wonderful, wonderful studio work they did during this time.
Yeah, they definitely, at this point, they had figured out how to capture some of that magic that they created on the stage.
Yeah.
And to be able to translate it through the studio. And, this, as we said at the top here, that skiffle spirit of never, they never stop mixing and matching and trying new things. And so they segue, as we'll get into, they segue into, hey, reggae, and hey, Middle Eastern music, and hey, more sort of almost cinematic kind of stuff. It's a very fascinating ride through. And isn't it a kicker that a band that almost bankrupted itself from indulgences of the studio within 3 years was afforded the opportunity to have their own imprint?
Yes, I know. The Dead, they started out as counterculture. They became very much embedded in the culture by the time they were done.
Oh, absolutely. And so with that said, folks, if you disagree with anything we've said or have any thoughts about what we've said, curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. As you've heard at the very beginning of the show, please feel free to join our curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/curmudgeonly. And as I said here, in the days after we drop this here episode, we will be creating a Spotify playlist that you can access so you can hear all 5 of the records that we talked about in running order, back to back to back to back to back. So, after the Grateful Dead evolved from heroes of the psychedelic underground to makers of generation-defining songs and albums, what's next? Most of you know that by the end of the 1970s, the band had created the most incredible and most deservedly famous touring phenomenon known to man. Yet, as we will discuss in part 2 of this series, just because they were made in that cult shade did not mean they shut off the creative faucet while riding that train that was Dead Ink. They had some really great albums left in them, and we will tell you all about those records when next we meet on the Curmudgeon Rock Report.